The conference room felt smaller than it should have. Glass walls on 3 sides, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and 2 HR representatives sitting across from me with identical expressions of rehearsed sympathy. Outside, I could see security guards waiting by the elevators, their presence no accident. Blake Weller, my manager, sat at the head of the table with his hands folded like a patient teacher about to deliver disappointing news. He slid a stack of papers toward me. The top page had my name highlighted in yellow, circled twice in red ink. "Madeline," he said, his voice steady and almost kind, "you're the only name on the report." I stared at the documents. $50 million in missing pharmaceutical inventory, shipment records, authorization codes. Every trail of digital breadcrumbs somehow led back to my workstation, my login credentials, my approval stamps. I looked up at Blake, searching his face for some sign that this was a mistake, some glitch we'd laugh about later over coffee. Instead, he gave me a small, knowing smile. The kind of smile that said this conversation was already over before it began. That's when I understood. I wasn't being investigated. I was being sacrificed. And Blake had planned every second of it. 4 hours earlier, everything had felt normal. Better than normal, actually. Blake had called me into the executive briefing room that morning, where the senior leadership team was reviewing quarterly logistics performance. I'd prepared the presentation the night before, triple-checking every number like I always did. My accuracy rate was something I took pride in. 99.7% over 3 years. Blake knew that. Everyone knew that. Madeline's attention to detail is exactly why our pharmaceutical shipments have maintained perfect compliance, Blake had said, gesturing toward my charts on the screen. She's the backbone of this operation. The executives nodded. A few smiled at me. I felt validated, respected. Blake shook my hand afterward, his grip firm and confident. "Keep doing what you're doing," he'd said. I'd walked back to my desk feeling like I finally belonged in this company, like my years of careful work were being recognized. I had no idea I was watching a performance. Blake wasn't praising me. He was establishing credibility, creating a record of trust that would make my fall look even more shocking. The announcement about the internal audit came 20 minutes later, delivered through a company-wide email. "Routine financial review," it said. "Nothing to worry about." But Blake's face when he read it told a different story. Something changed in Blake after that audit announcement. The easy confidence he'd always carried turned into something sharper, more watchful. He started hovering near my desk during shipment processing windows, asking questions about protocols he'd never cared about before. Why did I verify certain vendors twice? What made me flag specific authorization requests? His questions felt less like curiosity and more like measuring how much I actually knew. He began controlling approvals differently too, requiring secondary sign-offs on shipments that had previously moved through standard channels. At first, I thought he was just being cautious because of the audit. But then I noticed he was only adding extra layers to specific routes, specific vendors. The pattern was subtle, but it was there. Blake was nervous about something. And whatever he was hiding, it had to do with the pharmaceutical shipments that moved the most money through our logistics network. The high-value shipment went missing on a Tuesday. $50 million worth of controlled medications vanished somewhere between our distribution center and the hospital network on the East Coast. Blake called an emergency team meeting that afternoon. His face pale but controlled. "We need to figure out what happened," he said, looking directly at me. "Fast." I didn't know it then, but the trap was already closing. I couldn't sleep that night. $50 million didn't just disappear. Medications like that had tracking codes, GPS monitoring, chain of custody documentation at every checkpoint. Something this valuable didn't vanish by accident. Someone had to actively hide it. So I did what I always did when numbers didn't make sense. I went looking for the source. I started with the internal shipping manifest, cross-referencing the original order against the transportation logistics. The shipment had left our facility exactly on schedule. The tracking showed normal progress for the first 6 hours. Then, right outside Philadelphia, the route changed. Not a delay. Not a theft. A deliberate reroute to a different destination entirely. And that kind of change required high-level authorization from someone with administrative override access. I checked my own approval history just to be sure. Nothing. I hadn't touched that shipment. I'd never even seen the order until Blake mentioned it in the meeting. So I pulled the authorization logs from the system, the digital record that tracked every major decision made on high-value cargo. The reroute had been approved. The timestamp was clear. The authority level was management tier. But the name attached to that approval wasn't mine. It was Blake's. And he'd never mentioned that part to anyone. The team meeting the next morning felt different. Blake stood at the front of the conference room with his tablet in hand, pulling up shipping data and talking through the timeline. His voice was calm, measured, almost sympathetic. Then he paused on a screen showing my workstation access logs. "Now, I'm not saying anyone did anything deliberately wrong," Blake said, glancing around the room before his eyes settled on me. "But Madeline did process the initial shipment request. And her credentials were active during the reroute window." Heads turned. I felt the weight of 20 pairs of eyes landing on me at once. My stomach dropped. Blake kept talking, explaining how easy it was to make mistakes under pressure, how complex these systems were. He wasn't accusing me directly. He was doing something worse. He was planting doubt, letting everyone else fill in the narrative while he played the role of the reasonable manager just trying to understand what went wrong. "I'm sure there's an explanation," he added, giving me a small, understanding nod. "Madeline's always been reliable. I'm confident we'll figure this out together." But I saw what he was doing. He was framing me gently, carefully, so when the hammer finally fell, everyone would remember this moment and think they'd seen it coming. 2 hours later, HR called me in for a formal statement. Blake caught me in the hallway right after the HR meeting. He pulled me into an empty office, closing the door with a soft click. His expression was different now, less performative. Almost genuine. "Madeline, listen," he said, lowering his voice like we were sharing a secret. "I know how this looks. The audit team is under pressure. They need someone to blame, and right now, your name is attached to this shipment." I waited, not sure where he was going. Blake leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "I've been thinking about your options," he continued. "If you resign now, before the investigation gets deeper, it looks like a personal decision. Health reasons, family issues, whatever story works. You leave with your reputation mostly intact." The suggestion hung in the air between us like poison. Blake wasn't offering advice. He was offering me a way to disappear quietly, to take the fall and vanish before anyone asked harder questions. That's when I understood the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't panic. Blake wasn't scrambling to save himself. This was strategy. He'd thought this through, planned every move, and now he was giving me the chance to make it easy for him. If I resigned, I'd be admitting guilt without anyone needing proof. Blake would be safe. The missing inventory would remain a mystery, and I'd carry the suspicion for the rest of my career. I looked him in the eye and said the only thing I could. "I'm not resigning." They suspended me the next morning. Administrative leave, pending investigation. My building access was revoked. My system login credentials were frozen. Security escorted me to my desk to collect personal items while my colleagues watched from behind their monitors, pretending not to stare. I packed my coffee mug, a framed photo, a notepad. Blake stood near the exit with his arms crossed, watching me leave with an expression that almost looked like pity. Outside, sitting in my car in the parking garage, I felt the full weight of what Blake had done. He'd locked me out of everything. No access to files, no way to check records, no ability to defend myself with the tools I'd need. He thought he'd cornered me completely, left me with nothing but my word against a mountain of circumstantial evidence. Blake assumed I was finished. He assumed I'd give up, fade away, maybe hire a lawyer who'd negotiate some quiet settlement. What Blake didn't know was that I'd been in logistics for 8 years. I knew how systems worked. I knew what got archived, what got forgotten, and what nobody thought to delete. And I remembered something Blake had definitely forgotten. Something that might still exist in a place he'd never think to look. I filed the request through the company's legal data retention portal. Every employee had the right to request archived records tied to their work history, especially during formal investigations. It was policy. The company had to comply. I specifically asked for shipment logs from the previous software migration, 3 years ago when we'd switched to the new tracking system. He hesitated, sending me 2 clarification emails asking why I needed outdated files. I responded carefully, citing my right to review historical performance data relevant to my case. Took 4 days, but they finally released the files. A massive zip folder containing thousands of shipping manifests, authorization records, and system logs that had been archived during the transition. Most of it was useless, digitized clutter from a system nobody used anymore. But I wasn't looking for the main records. I was looking for the gaps, the inconsistencies, the places where someone might have tried to clean up their tracks without realizing that old systems don't delete things the same way new ones do. I opened the first batch of files on my laptop at home, spreading them across my dining table. Hours passed as I sorted through authorization chains, matching timestamps to user IDs. Then I found it. A series of shipment approvals that should have existed but didn't. The files were incomplete. Not corrupted. Not lost. Deliberately removed. And the pattern of missing data aligned perfectly with Blake's approval windows over the past 18 months. The timestamps told the story Blake thought he'd erased. When you delete something from a modern system, it leaves traces. Metadata. Edit logs. Fragments of code that mark when a file was accessed, modified, or removed. I wasn't a forensic analyst, but I'd worked with these systems long enough to recognize patterns. The missing logs weren't random. They clustered around high-value shipments during specific quarters when Blake had been under pressure to meet cost reduction targets. I cross-referenced the gaps with external vendor records that I'd kept in my personal files from previous audits. Vendors were required to maintain parallel documentation for compliance. If I could match their records to the holes in our internal system, I could prove that someone had gone back and selectively removed evidence. The timeline started coming together. Blake hadn't just rerouted one shipment. This had been happening for over a year. Small diversions that probably saved him budget overruns, made his performance numbers look better, kept executive pressure off his department. Then I found something even better. A parallel vendor confirmation record that hadn't been uploaded to our main system. It was sitting in a shared compliance folder that only got reviewed during annual audits. The file was a PDF scan of a physical shipping manifest. And at the bottom, in blue ink, was a handwritten signature authorizing a destination change. The signature was Blake's. I sat back in my chair, staring at my laptop screen, feeling something cold and precise settle in my chest. I called the vendor directly. FreightCor Logistics, a third-party carrier we'd used for East Coast routes. I identified myself as Madeline Cross, Senior Logistics Analyst, and explained that I was conducting an internal review of shipment protocols. The operations supervisor who answered was friendly and professional. "Sure, I can pull up the records," he said. "Which shipment are you asking about?" I gave him the tracking number for the missing $50 million delivery. I heard him typing, clicking through screens. "Okay, yeah, I see it here," he said. "That one got rerouted mid-transit. Happens sometimes with high-priority orders. Hospital Network requested a destination change due to capacity issues at the original facility. Do you have the authorization on file?" Asked, keeping my voice steady. More typing. Then a pause. "Yeah, we've got the internal approval in the system. Let me check who signed off." Another pause, longer this time. "Wasn't that Blake Weller, your operations manager? His signatures on the change request we received." I thanked him and hung up. Blake had authorized the reroute himself. He'd signed the documents, submitted the request, and then turned around and blamed me when the inventory went missing. The vendor had no reason to lie. They'd kept records because that's what compliance required. Blake had gambled that nobody would check with them directly. He'd gambled wrong. Now I had external confirmation. I had timestamps. I had his signature. And I had time. Because Blake thought I was already defeated. I made a decision then that probably saved me. I stopped trying to clear my name quickly. Every instinct told me to call HR immediately, to send the evidence, to demand they reopen the investigation right now. But I knew how these things worked. If I moved too fast, Blake would have time to pivot, to create new explanations, to muddy the water before anyone dug too deep. Speed would save him, not me. So instead I slowed down. I documented everything methodically. I created folders with labeled evidence, organized by date and source. I backed up files to 3 different locations. I built a timeline that was so detailed, so clearly sourced, that no reasonable person could dismiss it. I spent 2 weeks doing this, working 12-hour days at my dining table while Blake assumed I was sitting at home panicking. And while I worked, Blake got comfortable. I knew he would. Comfortable people make mistakes. They overreach. They stop being careful because they think they've already won. I didn't reach out to anyone. I didn't hint that I had evidence. I let Blake think he'd buried me completely. And sure enough, 3 weeks into my suspension, Blake made his move. He submitted a formal incident report to HR, escalating the investigation. The report claimed that the shipment logs had been corrupted by unauthorized access from my credentials after my suspension. He was trying to make it look like I'd tampered with evidence. But his timeline didn't match reality. And that would be his undoing. Blake's report was detailed and professional, the kind of document that looked convincing if you didn't check the dates too carefully. He claimed that between the initial investigation and my suspension, someone had accessed the archived shipment files and altered timestamps. He suggested that my credentials had been used during this window, implying that I'd tried to cover my tracks. HR forwarded me a copy of his report as part of the formal process. I read it 3 times, highlighting the dates Blake referenced. Then I checked my own access logs, the ones IT had provided as part of my data request. Blake had made a critical error. The dates he claimed I'd accessed the files were after my suspension, after my system credentials had been completely revoked. There was no possible way I could have logged into anything during that window. I didn't have access. IT could confirm that with a single database query. Blake had overplayed his hand. He'd been so eager to paint me as desperate and guilty that he'd invented a timeline that couldn't exist. And he'd put it in writing, submitted officially, with his name attached. I almost smiled reading it. This wasn't just evidence of his original crime anymore. This was evidence that Blake was actively fabricating accusations, lying to investigators, trying to frame an innocent person. And unlike the missing inventory, which could theoretically be explained as a mistake, this was deliberate. This was prosecutable. Blake had just handed me everything I needed. Now I just had to wait for the right moment. The real breakthrough came from the physical archives. Not everything gets digitized immediately when systems migrate. Sometimes paper records get scanned and uploaded months later, tucked into folders that don't sync with the main database. I'd requested access to the physical archive room at our facility through my attorney, citing evidence preservation rights. The company couldn't refuse without looking like they were hiding something. I spent an entire afternoon in that dusty room with boxes of old manifests stacked floor to ceiling. Most of it was useless, compliance paperwork from years ago. But then I found a box labeled Q3, Q4 expedited shipments from 2 years back. Inside were physical sign-off sheets that drivers had submitted before the digital signature system went fully online. These were the actual documents that Blake had signed in person, scanned copies of which should have been in the system but mysteriously weren't. I pulled out sheet after sheet, and there they were. Blake's handwritten signature on reroute authorization forms, approving destination changes, overriding standard protocols. There were at least 12 different shipments spanning 18 months. Not 1 or 2 mistakes. Pattern. System. Blake had been doing this for years, diverting inventory to alternate locations, probably taking kickbacks from vendors or inflating budget numbers. And now he was trying to pin his entire operation on me. I took photos of every page. Then I submitted a formal request to present my findings at the final disciplinary review. HR scheduled it for the following week. Blake would be there. So would the legal team. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't afraid. The days before the review were strange. I could feel people's opinions of me hardening, calcifying around the narrative Blake had created. Former colleagues stopped returning my messages. People I'd worked with for years crossed the street when they saw me in town. Even friends from outside work seemed uncomfortable, unsure what to say. Everyone thought I was about to be fired. Everyone thought Blake had won. I saw him once during that week, at a coffee shop near the office. He was with 2 other managers laughing about something, looking relaxed and confident. He noticed me standing in line and gave me a small nod, almost sympathetic. Like he felt bad about what was happening but knew it was necessary. I nodded back and ordered my coffee. Inside I felt nothing but cold clarity. Blake thought this was over. He thought he'd constructed something so airtight that my final review would just be a formality, a procedural step before termination. What he didn't know was that I'd spent the past month building a case so thorough, so documented, so undeniable that his entire story would collapse the moment I started talking. I wasn't going into that review to defend myself. I was going in to dismantle him, piece by piece, signature by signature, lie by lie. And Blake had no idea what I was bringing with me. HR sent the meeting agenda 3 days before the review. Blake would present his findings first, summarizing the evidence against me. Then I'd have an opportunity to respond. Standard procedure for disciplinary hearings. What surprised me was Blake's response when I formally requested to present my own evidence. I'd expected pushback, maybe an attempt to limit what I could show. Instead, Blake approved it immediately. His email was almost friendly. Of course, Madeline should have the chance to share her perspective. I want to make sure this process is fair and thorough. Let's give her all the time she needs. He copied HR, legal, and the executive team. It was perfect optics. Blake positioning himself as the reasonable manager who wanted truth and fairness. But I understood what he was really thinking. He was confident. Completely, utterly confident that I had nothing that could challenge his narrative. Blake thought he'd covered every angle. He'd locked me out of systems, submitted official reports, created a paper trail that made me look guilty. He genuinely believed that whatever I brought to this meeting would be weak, desperate, easily dismissed. And that confidence would be his downfall. Because Blake had forgotten the first rule of logistics that I'd learned years ago. Everything leaves a trail. You can hide it. You can bury it. You can delete files and remove names. But somewhere, somehow, the truth always leaves a trail. And I'd found every single breadcrumb Blake thought he'd erased. The conference room was packed. HR, legal counsel, 2 executives I'd never met, Blake and me. I dressed carefully that morning, professional but not defensive. I wanted to look like someone presenting facts, not someone begging for mercy. Blake sat across from me, his posture relaxed, his expression neutral. He glanced at the folder I'd brought, probably wondering what kind of weak defense I'd prepared. When my turn came, I didn't start with accusations. I didn't mention Blake at all. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up a timeline. I want to walk through the shipment life cycle, I said calmly. From initial order to final destination. Just the facts. I showed the original hospital network request, the warehouse fulfillment, the carrier assignment, each step clean and procedural. Blake watched, arms crossed, probably wondering where this was going. Then I showed the reroute. Here's where the destination changed, I said, highlighting the timestamp. This required management-level authorization. I paused, letting that sink in. At this point in the timeline, I was not assigned to this shipment. I had no access to modify routing. One of the executives leaned forward. Then who authorized the change? I didn't answer yet. Instead, I pulled up the next document. Let's look at what the vendor received. And that's when the room started asking Blake questions. I displayed the first archived log, the one with Blake's digital signature approving the reroute. The timestamp was clear. The authority level was management. Blake barely glanced at it. "That's taken out of context," he said smoothly. "Managers approve routing changes all the time. That doesn't mean I knew the shipment would go missing." I nodded like that was a reasonable point. "You're right," I said. "One approval could be routine." Then I pulled up the second document. Another reroute, different shipment 6 months earlier. Blake's signature again. His expression tightened slightly, but he maintained composure. "These are standard operations," he said. "You're cherry-picking normal approvals and making them look suspicious." "Okay," I replied. Then I showed the third signature. And the fourth. And the fifth. Each one a high-value shipment. Each one rerouted. Each one carrying Blake's authorization. The pattern became undeniable. This wasn't routine. This was systematic. The legal counsel started taking notes. One of the executives asked Blake directly, "How many of these route changes did you personally authorize?" Blake's face had lost its color. "I'd have to review my records," he said. His voice was still steady, but something had shifted. He was starting to realize I hadn't come here with nothing. Come here with everything. And he was just beginning to understand how thoroughly he'd been caught. I pulled up the master timeline then, the one I'd spent 3 weeks building. On the left side, vendor timestamps showing when reroute requests were received. In the middle, internal system logs showing when approvals were processed. On the right, Blake's access records showing exactly when he'd logged into the authorization system. Every single data point aligned perfectly. The shipments Blake claimed he knew nothing about had his fingerprints all over them. "These are the external vendor confirmations," I said, pulling up FreightCor's records. "They document every authorization they received, including signatures." I zoomed in on one of the scanned documents. Blake's handwritten signature, clear as day. "And these are the internal access logs showing which manager credentials were used." I highlighted Blake's user ID. The timestamps matched exactly. The room was silent now. The story Blake had told, the one where I'd somehow stolen $50 million worth of inventory, couldn't exist anymore. Not with this evidence. Not with his name on every authorization, his signature on every form, his access recorded at every critical moment. Char asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Madeline, are you saying Blake authorized all of these reroutes?" I looked directly at Blake. "I'm saying the evidence shows someone with Blake's credentials and signature authorized them. Multiple times. Over 18 months. Blake tried to interrupt. He started to say something about shared access, about how maybe someone used his login. But the legal counsel cut him off. "Blake, we're going to need to pause this review." Security was already standing. Blake looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time since this whole nightmare started. I saw the exact moment it clicked in his mind. The realization that I hadn't been defending myself this entire time. I'd been building a case against him. All those weeks when he thought I was sitting at home defeated, I'd been gathering every piece of evidence he'd left behind. Every signature he'd forgotten about. Every archived file he thought was safely deleted. Every vendor record he didn't know existed. His face went through several expressions in quick succession. Confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally something that looked like fear. He'd underestimated me completely. He'd seen me as a detail-oriented analyst who followed rules and checked boxes. He'd never considered that those same skills could be turned around and used to hunt him. That the same precision I'd used to maintain 99.7% accuracy could be used to document his crimes with perfect clarity. Blake started to stand. His mouth opening like he wanted to say something. An explanation, maybe. An excuse. But HR held up a hand. "Blake, we need you to step outside with security," they said. Their voice was professional but firm. This wasn't a request. Blake looked at me one more time. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just met his eyes and nodded once. The same nod he'd given me in the coffee shop when he thought he'd won. Then he walked out of the conference room with security following 2 steps behind. And the door closed. After Blake left, the room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then the senior executive, a woman named Patricia Vance, leaned back in her chair and looked at me with something that might have been respect. "Madeline," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something directly. During the period these shipments were rerouted, who had exclusive authority to approve destination changes for high-value pharmaceutical cargo?" I'd prepared for this question. I pulled up the company's authorization matrix, the document that defined which employees could do what within the logistics system. For shipments valued over $10 million, only operations managers at Blake's level or higher could authorize routing changes, I said. Analysts like me could process orders and track shipments, but we couldn't override destinations. "And during the specific time periods in question?" Patricia asked. I highlighted Blake's name on the organizational chart. Blake Weller was the only operations manager assigned to pharmaceutical logistics during this 18-month window. His predecessor retired, and his replacement didn't start until last month. Every answer pointed to Blake. Every piece of evidence, every timestamp, every signature. There was no way to explain this as a mistake or a misunderstanding. Blake had exclusive access, exclusive authority, and exclusive motive. He'd been diverting inventory for over a year, and when the audit came, he'd panicked and tried to frame me to cover his tracks. Patricia looked at the legal counsel. "I think we have everything we need," she said. The legal counsel nodded. Then Patricia turned to me. "Madeline, we owe you an apology." They asked Blake to come back into the room 30 minutes later. HR had spent that time reviewing the evidence I'd presented, cross-referencing it with their own investigation files. When Blake walked back in, his lawyer was with him. I could tell from Blake's face that he knew what was coming. He didn't look at me. He sat down stiffly, hands clasped on the table in front of him. Patricia Vance spoke first. "Blake, based on the evidence presented today, we're placing you on immediate administrative suspension pending a full internal investigation. Security will escort you from the building. You're to have no contact with staff or systems until this is resolved." Blake's lawyer started to object, but Patricia held up her hand. "We have documentation showing your authorization on multiple unauthorized shipments. We have vendor confirmations. We have access logs. We have your signature on physical documents. This isn't speculation, Blake. This is fact." Blake finally looked at me. Not with anger exactly. More like he couldn't quite believe this was happening. That I'd actually beaten him. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Madeline," he said quietly. "Can we talk? Privately? Just for a minute?" The room went still. Everyone looked at me. Could have said no. I could have let him be walked out right then. But I wanted to hear what he'd say. What explanation he thought could possibly matter now. I looked at HR. They hesitated, then nodded. 2 minutes, Patricia said. In the hallway. With the door open. Blake and I stood in the hallway outside the conference room. Through the open door I could see everyone watching us. Blake ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him do 100 times when he was stressed. "Madeline, listen," he said, his voice low and urgent. "This is a misunderstanding. Yes, I authorized those reroutes, but I had good reasons. Budget pressure, vendor negotiations, things you don't see at your level." I didn't interrupt. I just waited. Blake kept talking faster now. "I never meant for you to get caught up in this. That wasn't personal. I was just trying to protect the department, and when the audit came I panicked. But we can fix this. You can explain to them that I was just doing my job, that the reroutes were legitimate operations decisions." He actually thought I would help him. After everything he'd done, he genuinely believed I might cover for him. "Blake," I said, my voice quiet but clear. "You tried to destroy my career to save yourself. You let everyone think I stole $50 million. You made my colleagues turn against me. You asked me to resign in shame. I know, and I'm sorry, Blake said quickly. I made a mistake. But if you help me explain this, we can both walk away from this. I'll tell them you were never involved. I'll make sure your record is clean. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said the only thing that mattered. No. Blake blinked. What? No, I repeated. I'm not helping you. You made your choices. Now live with them. The formal apology came in writing 3 days later. A letter from HR, copied to Patricia Vance and the legal team, stating that I had been fully cleared of all accusations. My personnel record would be corrected to show that the suspension was unwarranted, and that I had been unjustly implicated in an investigation that should never have included my name. They offered to reinstate me immediately with full back pay for the time I'd been suspended. The letter was professional, apologetic, and thorough. It acknowledged that the company had failed to properly verify Blake's accusations before taking action against me. It praised my cooperation during the investigation and my professionalism throughout a difficult process. Everything I should have wanted to hear. But sitting at my kitchen table reading that letter, I realized something important. I didn't want to go back. Not because I was bitter, though I had every right to be. Not because I couldn't forgive, though forgiveness would take time. But because staying at a company where my integrity had been questioned, where I'd needed this much evidence just to prove I hadn't committed a crime I'd never been anywhere near, that would mean accepting that this kind of thing was normal. That being sacrificed to protect someone else's mistakes was just part of the job. I'd proven I didn't do anything wrong. Now I needed to prove that I respected myself enough to walk away from a place that hadn't respected me. So I made my own decision. I wrote my resignation letter that same afternoon. It was brief, professional, and final. After careful consideration, I have decided to resign from my position as Senior Logistics Analyst, effective immediately. I appreciate the opportunity to have worked here and wish the company success in the future. I didn't mention Blake. I didn't mention the investigation. I didn't list grievances or demand further apologies. I just resigned. On my terms. With my integrity intact and my head high. HR called me the next day, confused. Madeline, you don't have to leave, they said. We've cleared your record. We're offering full reinstatement. We want you to stay. I appreciated that. I really did. But I explained what I'd already decided. I don't want to work somewhere I had to prove this hard that I wasn't a criminal, I said. I deserve better than that. And I'm going to go find it. They tried to negotiate. They offered a promotion, a raise, a transfer to a different department. But I'd already made peace with my choice. I wasn't running away. I was walking away with dignity, with evidence of my competence, and with the knowledge that I'd handled the worst professional crisis of my life with precision and grace. 2 weeks later, I started a new job at a competitor. They'd heard about what happened, about how I'd cleared my name. They called it the most impressive problem-solving they'd ever seen. Called it just doing my job. But doing it somewhere that would actually value it. Blake was terminated 6 weeks after that final review. The internal investigation confirmed what I'd already shown them. Over 18 months, Blake had authorized 23 unauthorized shipment reroutes, diverting nearly $200 million in pharmaceutical inventory through alternate channels. Some of it had been recovered. Some was still missing. And all of it pointed back to Blake working with external vendors to inflate budgets and skim profits. The missing $50 million shipment that started everything. They found it in a warehouse in Delaware, sitting in climate-controlled storage under a shell company Blake had created. He'd planned to blame me, let the investigation die, then quietly move the inventory back into legitimate channels months later. He'd done it before. This time he just got caught. Blake pled guilty to fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying corporate records. His sentencing hearing was scheduled for next spring. I didn't plan to attend. I'd already moved on. I heard through former colleagues that my name had been restored in every company database. My accuracy record was intact. My reputation had been cleared. People who'd avoided me during the investigation reached out to apologize, to say they should have known better. I appreciated that. But I'd learned something valuable through all of this. The people who matter don't need overwhelming evidence to believe in your integrity. And the people who don't believe in you without evidence don't actually matter. I didn't scream. I didn't cheat. I didn't fight dirty or bend rules to win. I just let the truth finish what arrogance started. And in the end, that was enough.